So just a little bit about me. My wife Sarah and I manage Scholls Valley Native Nursery. We farm about 60 acres in western Washington County. We're just west of Forest Grove, so it's an easy little drive up there. If you ever want to come see us, please do. If you're interested in beaver, it's a great place to come. We put about 20 acres of our farm into a conservation easement, and we focused all of our efforts on restoring beaver habitat in that 20 acres. These are my kids. They're all grown up now. They don't look like this anymore. But I've got 2 grandsons now, and that's the center of my life. But these folks, this is what it's about, right? We should all be able to agree on that one thing, right? Nothing else. It's a starting point. I still spend a lot of time looking and studying alders. I completed my PhD at Oregon State in 2021. I went back after, 30 years because I kept coming up these questions. I would ask my wife Sarah, and she'd say, "Don't ask me." She said, "You need to go back to school." And I kept not wanting to do that because I hated school. But I did. I went back, and it was a wonderful experience. I would never do it again, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It opened my mind in ways that I can't even begin to express. Science is a fantastic thing, but science is not the answer, right? Science tells us little things about tiny little bits of the universe. If we're lucky, right? If we're lucky, it's telling something true. But it's just this little view. And we've untethered that little piece from the rest of the universe so that we can study it. We have to step back and look at the big picture in order to understand what that thing means. And there's really probably no better case in point than my work, which was in molecular biology and population genetics. And I ended up focusing on alders, which are a fantastic group of trees. This is white alder, Ulmus rhombifolia, and in fact, your watershed is a really interesting place to look at this particular plant. So I've spent most of my career now managing landscapes, and what I've come to view as my gift, I guess, I don't know, is an interest in diversity. I like to manage for diversity. When I started working on this particular piece of ground, it was in wheat and potatoes. It was a rotten piece of ground. Clay, wet. It's got about 2 feet of water standing on it right now. Really hard to farm. My good friend Jay Hoffman, who's a farmer in Washington County, was so tired of farming this piece of ground. He was really, really glad when we took it out of production. Metro owns this piece of ground. I don't know if you know who Metro is. This is what they now call Quamish Prairie, and you can see why. Okay, so managing for diversity. Well, we also, so I'm interested in beaver. I'm going to rabbit trail here a little bit. Very interested in beaver. Beaver, fantastic. We'll get back to the topic. But managing for diversity means all of this stuff. This is a little spring beauty, Claytonia siberica. And this was just a pocket full of seeds that I threw out in a little patch of oak trees. Actually, it's on university property. We had put some sheep through there, and they sort of grubbed up the ground. We cut all the blackberries down, and I just threw these pockets of this little spring beauty out there, and it popped up the next spring, this beautiful flower. And this fly shows up, right? This little pollinating fly. Who knows what this thing is? Any entomologists in here today? Nobody probably knows what this thing is. I have no idea what it is. But you do stuff like this, and what happens in response is always fascinating. Anyway, it's a fly. We've done a lot of work recently, my wife Sarah and I, with the Oregon Bee Project, which is a great program down at Oregon State University. Wonderful people. They got an army of volunteers that's going around the state looking at bees. And they come to our farm, they say, we see more bees, more different kinds of bees on your farm than any place else we look, which is great. It's very validating. But they're wonderful people. But I said, as I'm looking around at our farm and all the flowers and stuff that we've got, and we've got bees, we've got lots of bees, bumblebees and honeybees and little solitary bees, all kinds of bees. But we also have a lot of flies, incredible diversity of flies. And I said, well, what about the Oregon Fly Project? It doesn't have the same cachet. the first thing that we think about as humans, I think we realize, we come to this realization there's this piece missing in our management thinking. And oh, it's the beaver. And they're so important. And, oh my gosh, we want more and more beaver. And then we get this idea, well, we've got to get in there, we've got to help the beaver. The beaver don't need our help, generally speaking. The most important thing that they need is space. They need a place to be, to do what they do. If we give them that space, and if it's missing, the other piece that they need is something to build with. And if we give them those things, they do what they do, they don't need any other help from us. And that's an absolute fact. Beaver dam analogs, stuff we stick in the creek, all that stuff, they don't want it. It doesn't help, actually. But we've all kind of jumped in there and we just want to help and make it better. Sometimes what we do doesn't really help. So here's a beaver building a beaver the way the beaver like to build dams. This is a fairly small dam, but one of the things you'll see in these early stages of dam construction is these long stems. And the beaver will take these long sticks. They'll often use red osier dogwood. You'll rarely, if ever, see the bark get peeled off the dogwood because it's really thin and not very tasty to them. They don't like it. But they love it as a dam building material. And they'll take the whole stem, they'll cut it up here somewhere up above, and then they'll drag it down the stream with the butt end pointed downstream. And they'll just lay it there in the bottom of the creek or the ditch or whatever it is they're trying to block. So you'll have this long stem kind of with the butt end downstream with all the branches and twigs and stuff pointed upstream. And you'll look at it and it seems very haphazard. What are these things, what are they doing here? You might even see just 2 or 3 sticks laid like that in the stream. You'll think, huh. And you'll come back the next day and what you'll see is that they've added a couple more and then they've started to weave shorter sticks into the branches that are sticking upstream. And so they have this system of construction. It is by no means is this a haphazard thing that they do. They got these twigs that are all sticking, they start weaving the shorter sticks in up here. And then they get to a certain point and they start shoving mud and grass and other stuff against the upslope side of that incipient dam. And they really start to chink it and shut off the water flow. And then they'll use the pool to help them raft more material and more material. But they'll continue to lay these layers, these long sticks. They'll drape them over the tops of well-established dams. This is kind of important stuff because this is the way they want to do it. When we go in there and we do the beaver dam analog thing and start jamming up vertical stuff into the substrate of the stream, we're actually messing with this system. And what you'll find is they have a harder time actually plugging them up at the upper end. It's a really cool thing. But when you think about how this works, these are the primary structure. It's like this spring-loaded system. You start pushing at the head of that dam, and what you're pushing into is a whole bunch of really tough springs. And it's the spring action that gives these dams the resilience and strength that they need to withstand floods. And they're incredibly, incredibly strong structures. It takes an unbelievable amount of force to bust through one of these things. And they're also designed to overtop. So when the beaver dam overtops, all of that flow and all of the strength of the water is broken. The force of the water is broken in falling through all of this structure here. It's a really remarkable thing. It is not haphazard. So this is Fano Creek. I don't know if anybody knows Fano Creek, which is kind of in urban western Multnomah County and Washington County. It flows through Beaverton and Tigard and then drops into the Tualatin River at Cook Park. Fano Creek is a substantial stream, and it's incredibly flashy at that point in the watershed. It's a large third or fourth order stream, and yet it's spanned with beaver dams. Quite remarkable. I think I'll tell this story now. When was it? Gosh, no, it was 2002. I got a call from a woman at DEQ who was beginning to consider a proposal by Clean Water Services, which used to be Unified Sewerage Agency of Washington County. It's basically the sewerage utility in Washington County. And Clean Water Services had a problem. They had to put their treated sewage somewhere, and that somewhere was the Tualatin River. And the Tualatin River has TMDLs for temperature, and the water that they were putting back into the river was too warm. And so they were faced ultimately with having to build cooling towers or mechanically somehow cool this water. If you can imagine cooling all that water is ridiculous. But somebody got the bright idea that, well, wait, what if we plant trees along the river and streams in the Tualatin Basin? We'll shade the water and we'll mitigate for this increased temperature water, this hot effluent that we have to put back in the river. And DEQ somehow remarkably bought off on this idea. They'd asked me if I thought it was possible. I said, yeah, we can plant trees along streams. That's not a problem. We can do a lot of that. And so the whole thing got stamped and approved, and Clean Water Services was off and running. They hired a guy named Peter Giese, great guy. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's no longer in Oregon. Yeah, give him a round of applause. And so Peter and I put together this program for Clean Water Services to plant trees along streams in Washington County. And we did it. I mean, I started contracting with various nurseries and trying to find native plants anywhere that I possibly could, which was not an easy thing to do at that point in time. It was easy to buy Doug fir. We get lots of that, but not usually the best choice for these wet, boggy, lowland spots. So anyway, we start cobbling it together. I was working with Kathy LeCompte over at Brooks Tree Farm. She was only one of the few bigger nursery folks that would actually even talk to me about growing stuff like dogwood. Everybody else said, no, I'm not going to grow that. So anyway, we set about building this program, and we just ratcheted up, 10,000 trees, 50,000, 100,000 trees. At this point, Clean Water Services is still at this point planting 250, 300,000 trees every year along streams in the Tualatin Basin for this exact purpose. But one day, Peter called me up, and we had just completed a project a couple of years prior, 3 years prior, on Beaverton Creek. And Peter calls me up one day, and he says, they're eating all of our trees. They're eating all of our trees. I said, Peter, what are you talking about? He said, the beaver, they're eating all of our trees. I said, calm down, tell me. He said, anyway, I said, he was just beside himself. And so I said, all right, Peter, I'll go take a look, and we'll figure it out. So I go to this site, and in fact, they had eaten all of our trees. Literally, they'd cut down 15,000, 20,000 trees. And they had used a small proportion of them to build a dam across Beaverton Creek, right in the middle of downtown Beaverton. And they backed up about 10 or 15 acres of water. Fortunately, it was all in this park, so it didn't really, nobody's house was flooded or anything like that. Nevertheless, I mean, there's some trails that were displaced. But anyway, I called Peter back and I said, wow, I don't know exactly what this is all about, but there's something really, really cool happening here. There's so much more to this than shade on the water. And as it turns out, it was never about shade on the water, right? Here we are, we're going to fix this problem, we're going to cool off the water, we're going to shade it, and everything's going to be great. We're going to take, these ditched little streams and these incised little urbanized streams and these ag ditches and everything else. We're going to put some shade on them and everything's going to be fine, all right? Well, it was a nice thought, but as is often the case, if we keep our eyes open and think about stuff, there's so much more to it than that. And so in preparation for that little course that I put together for Clackamas Community College, I thought, what would happen if I did a little GIS work and looked at soils in the Tualatin Basin just to see how it lays out on the landscape. And I thought, okay, I'll look at Veerbort, I'll look at Cove, I'll look at Wapato, I'll look at all these wetland clay soils that my friend Jay Hoffman calls beaver dam soils. I said, Jay, why do you call them beaver dams? Well, every once in a while you'll hit one with a plow. I said, what? Well, you hit an old beaver dam. It's still buried in the mud. And so anyway, it's an interesting thing. But these soils are associated with beaver. They formed in beaver swamps and marshes and ground that was flooded by beaver. And when you pull them up out of this is just data out of the Web Soil Survey. Anybody can get it. You can do this in the Lucky Mute. You pull up your wetland soil types and you map them and you get this incredible dendritic pattern. And basically there's these stringers of this wetland clay, these beaver-associated soils along all the streams and tributaries. And in fact, it's more extensive even than this. There's some glitches in I didn't have a whole lot of time to do this. But there's even more than this. But just looking at this ground, looking at the green in this, in Washington County on the Tualatin, it's 35,000 acres of beaver dam soils in the Tualatin Basin. That means that when the first European settlers came to the Tualatin Basin, there were 35,000 acres of beaver marsh in that watershed. It's an enormous amount of ground. So here's actually the town of Beaverton. Yeah, I love this. And zoom in a little more. So here is Tektronix. Nike, there's the Nike World Campus up there at the top. There's downtown Beaverton over here. You superimpose the beaver dam soils on Beaverton, on downtown Beaverton. That's what it looks like. And then you don't have to wonder where the name Beaverton came from. So now I've got this long stringer. We could flash through these really fairly quickly. A long stringer of just a time lapse, just Google Earth imagery. And I put this together specifically, this set of slides, for some regulatory folks at the state and the Corps of Engineers who are looking at this issue and still not understanding what I'm talking about. We're trying to do some substantial wetland restoration, and I've done it all with this stuff. I've built concrete structures, I've plugged up ditches, I've shoved sacks of concrete into old tiles, I've put cats and excavators and dump trucks and off-road dump trucks and scrapers out there to create these landscapes of wetlands and done some kind of interesting stuff. You always learn when you try stuff. It's all about the beaver. If we're actually talking about wetlands, wetland function, it's in this part of the world, it is all about beaver. It is literally all about beaver. There are very, very few wetlands in the Willamette Valley that aren't associated with beaver. That's not to say there are none. You can go up on the ridge here above town or in Washington County, Cooper Mountain, these upland sites, and you have CP wetlands that have nothing at all to do with beaver. That's true. They do exist. There's all kinds of wetlands. So this is Englewood Park, right in downtown, or actually between, right on the border between Beaverton and Tigard. Here's Fano Creek, very, very urban stream. The banks of Fano Creek, when I first encountered it, you'd walk out through this field, which is canary grass like this, and then the only way often you'd know you're on the banks of the creek is because you'd hit this wall of blackberry, and if you could push through that, you'd have to be careful because you'll just fall into this dirt chasm, and down there about 7 or 8 feet, there was Fano Creek gurgling along. And I nosed into this thing multiple times, trying to figure out what was what. This was in preparation for planting trees to put shade on the water. And also for some excavation work that Clean Water Services decided that they wanted to do to try to fix this problem. And I remember there were beaver there. And the reason I knew that there were beaver there is I looked down to this little ditch, this dirt canyon, and here's this oily, ugly little stream down there at the bottom. And there's a shopping cart down there, and the poor beaver were using that shopping cart to anchor their dams. So they're pushing canary grass up against this shopping cart to try to block the water in Fano Creek. It was sad. So anyway, here's the problem, right? We got this exposed stream, no shade, right? Shade's the problem. No shade on this stream. So we're going to plant trees, And more than that, we're going to reconnect this stream to its floodplain because it's disconnected from its floodplain because, again, it's down in the bottom of this 8-foot deep dirt canyon. So we mowed all the canary grass, and we brought in scrapers and excavators and dump trucks, and we started moving dirt around. And we didn't like the fact that Fano Creek had been ditched into this straight line ditch here. And so we re-meandered it into this nice S-curve, right? That's how nature is, it's nice sine waves. And moved a lot of dirt, spent a lot of money. Permits, excavators, off-road, dump trucks, sending dirt off to the landfill, all this stuff, crazy, crazy. Anyway, we did all this great stuff. And this is what it looked like what am I saying here? 2 years later, it looked like this. Stream is still in that sine wave curve. There's still no shade on the water. But there were a lot of trees. All of these rows are rows of cottonwoods and ash and willows and everything else that we had planted there. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So here it is in 2009. Still sine wave curve. Still no shade on the water. But the trees are getting bigger. Here we are in year 4. Still kind of the same thing, but you see this? Little patches of water starting to emerge up here. The beaver had started to plug up a little side channel that comes in right there. Things started to get a little more interesting by year 5. By year 6, the beaver had backed up enough water that they were frequently, the floodplain of the stream had actually now reconnected. Had nothing to do with the excavation work that we did, nothing at all. It had everything to do with the beaver building dams across Fano Creek. That's what reconnects floodplains. It's kind of a dark photo, but you can see we essentially have, and one of the things that's really always interesting about this, the beaver exposed what's really happening on the ground. You can see still that silly sine wave thing is still kind of here, but you can also see these other really interesting swales and channels that just appear in the landscape. Here we are in year 8, year 9, more and more water. Parts of the Fano Creek Trail have to actually be moved. Thankfully, we got them to do that. There were a lot of attempts to put in drains and beaver baffles and stuff like that. Whatever. 2016, 2017. So one of the issues that I've encountered here with the agencies, so as I've said, I've built structures and all kinds of stuff to manipulate ground to force it to be wet in various ways. And the agencies, bless their hearts, they don't like the structures. But when you propose a wetland where you're going to say, hey, we're not putting structures in, we're going to let the beaver do it, they say, what? How can you be sure that the beaver are going to do this? I mean, really? What happens if the beaver dam blows out? Or what happens if the beaver move away? Or what happens if they just don't show up at all? I have yet to encounter a place in Washington County at low elevations where beaver are not already there. They're just in hiding. They got nothing to eat, nothing to do. They're just burrowing into a bank trying to mind their own business, but there's nothing to eat. They always come. So far, anyway. They always come, and they do this. Here we are in 2018, and you can see it's all getting more and more interesting. So as the beaver do this, not only are they changing the morphology of the streams, reconnecting streams with their floodplains, creating enormous expanses of wetlands. The ground and the vegetation is responding as well. And it's responding to increasingly hydric conditions. And an awful lot of our flora can't hack it. And so you start to see emergence of areas of dead vegetation, trees that die. Things like alder can't hack it for the most part. There's more to that story, but we won't go there because I'd spend way too much time. Anyway, now we have exposed mudflats. And so this is the cycle, right? Okay, so it is true that beaver dams can blow out. It is true that beaver will move away. And there's reasons for that, right? They get to a point, they've eaten all of the good stuff, The willow is gone. The cottonwood is long gone. Anything else that they really like is just gone out of the landscape. And now they're stuck with the dogwood. It's thin, it's hard, not that great. Spirea, it's the worst thing. They hate it. They will eat it if they have to, but they're not happy about it. And when that's all that's left to eat in the neighborhood, it's time to go find someplace new. And they're trying to build dams out of this increasingly thin and sparse material. Their dams do get weaker. And you might have a blowout, and all of a sudden you got these mud flats. There is no better substrate in the world. In fact, it is the only substrate in the world that will support the regeneration of willows. Willows have to have bare mineral or organic substrates. They won't compete with even a light skiff of grass. They have to have this. And the only way you get it in the Willamette Valley is that brief period of time after the floodwaters abate and the ground that's been underwater for a long, long period of time is exposed, and now you got this mudflat habitat. There's still some willow. There's a lot of willows, tons of willows still around. There's plenty of seed source. Whoop, that comes in by the millions. Millions and millions of seedling willows will come in and really rapidly occupy these exposed mudflats. Here it is, Bannock Creek, Inglewood Park. It's fabulous. Please go see it. I think that's, here's the last one. Anyway, I mean, what an unbelievable transformation of a piece of ground. Okay, I got to start moving a little bit. One of the things that kind of came out of my analysis and that I was beginning to realize anyway, just based on my experience at our farm, is that there's something interesting also that happens at the slope, at the toe of the slope, whether you're in the Cascade, the toe of the Cascades or the toe of the Coast Range. Interesting things. And this is my wetland right here, part of the portion of that strip of green here. So here's Gales Creek right here, and here's this strip of wetland that's, several hundred yards off the main stem. Why is that? It's not associated with Gales Creek. Well, Gales Creek is a high velocity, relatively high gradient stream, gravel bottomed. There's beaver in it, but there's no way they're spanning that thing. It's way too big, way too much power. So here's our farm. This is Roderick Creek, which is a little stream that comes off of Gales Peak there, right off of our farm. When Sarah and I we bought this farm in 2008. And when we bought it, there was annual ryegrass and corn. So skipping forward, as I mentioned, we put about 20 acres of the farm into a conservation easement. And we did the sine wave thing. Yes, we did. We also did some excavation work, and we made this. I had already at this point, this was after Peter had called me up telling me that they'd eaten all of our trees. And so I was beginning to know better. And I told Peter, because Peter was involved with me in helping to design this project, and this gets back to the agencies again. I knew better. I said, the beaver are going to come and they're going to do what we already know they're going to do. But the agencies needed certainty. So we had to scrape 35,000 cubic yards of my class 1 soil out of my fields. That didn't go well. And build these ponds, basically. And the thing that was really awesome about that, they didn't fill up. And actually, everybody was pulling their hair out. It's not wet enough. Oh, no. Well, we planted trees. And the trees grew. And then the beaver did what they do. And there's our farm now. 20 acres of our farm is essentially beaver swamp. What does this all mean? If you take 35,000 acres of beaver swamp, drain it, you've just gotten rid of a whole lot of water. Just an enormous amount of water. Now what do? Well, we got to keep the corn green, so we suck what little water's left out of the creek to keep our corn green in August and September. It's about as insane as it could be, probably. We also spend enormous amounts of money, billions of dollars on water projects to get water from where it is to where we want it to be. So we built something like Hag Lake, which unfortunately wasn't designed for the big earthquake that we're supposed to have at some point in the future. So now they're going to have to rebuild it. I don't remember what the price tag was of it, but it's in the billions of dollars, I think, at this point. And you figure, okay, well, let's just take that money and let's just distribute it to every farmer in Washington County that's farming some lousy piece of clay that they hate farming anyway and that they're not making money on, and everybody will be better off. Anyway, you can do the math, and we restored 35,000 acres of beaver swamp, and we've just restored about 4 times the volume of Hag Lake, distributed across the Tualatin Basin. Oh, by the way, this was a portion of Fano Creek where we didn't scrape off the canary grass, so this was the beginning condition for a lot of the stuff. And this is what it looks like now. Oh, I should point out, so this was, I took this in, I don't remember what it was, January, February, miserable day. And the creek was high, but at low water, as I said, so the creek's up at about 7 or 8 feet higher than its summer low water. So again, this is the dirt canyon, just the water's filling it. But you can see the stream is not attached, it's not engaged with its floodplain. But here it very much is. You know, you put a ½ inch of rain on Beaverton and the water just goes whoop and fills up that whole bottom. It just pops right out. It's incredible. And this is what, you know, this is another funny thing, going back a few years more. The paradigm at BPA and the Corps of Engineers, and the paradigm actually that foresters were unfortunately involved in creating, we all had this idea that riparian zones in western Washington are all about Douglas fir. They're all about big Douglas fir falling over and landing in streams and then becoming salmon habitat. Well, that may be true in the Cascades and in the Coast Range, but it is not true necessarily on the floor of the Willamette Valley. It's not true in the lower reaches of the Luckiamute. It's not true in the lower reaches of the Tualatin. It's not about that at all. It's about beaver. That's what it's about. And what they're saying is, we can't, in fact, one of the reasons that the Corps of Engineers and BPA declined to support riparian revegetation and planting was because it was going to take 250 or 300 years to restore function. So we can't put there, no. So they wouldn't. You had to get the equipment in there. You had to break stuff. You had to breach levees, or you had to replace culverts or do something like that. Plant trees? Nah. We're going to wait 250 years for that to work. Less than 10 years from canary grass desert to this. It doesn't take long. Literally, 10 years. It's unbelievable. You know? I mean, these cottonwoods, they grow so fast. You know, and you know, so you got these cottonwoods, the beaver lop them off, you know, they gnaw the branches off, and then all of a sudden you got down wood in the stream. Unbelievable amounts of structure. We don't really have time to talk about selectivity, but selectivity is huge. It's the reason why they eat all the willows, and then you're left with, well, in some cases elderberry if it's not too wet, but spirea and 9-bark and stuff like that. So selectivity is really important. Plants. You know, palatable species versus unpalatable species. You got to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. Do you want to feed the beaver? Do you want to encourage them to build dams, or do you not? You can help direct to the extent to which they do one or the other by selecting plants that achieve that purpose. Willows, obviously very important. We could spend weeks talking about willows. I won't bore you with it, but willows are amazing. We have a lot of willow species on the floor of the Willamette Valley, probably somewhere around 8 taxa that are reasonably common. They're not that hard to identify. You just got to figure a few things out. It's a complex group, rife with hybridization and all kinds of weird introgression and stuff like that, but still reasonably tractable species that you can identify and tell one from another. They're ecologically differentiated. They're ecologically separated. They place themselves in the landscape where they want to be, and they keep themselves separate from one another because they're ecologically separated. They're not interchangeable, so don't think that they are. It's subtle, but it's real. So the question was, did we try to find the original path of Roderick Creek in order to recreate it? And the answer is no. I mean, it's a great idea. It's a good, I mean, it would be a logical thing to approach. If you're going to approach a project like that, you'd want to try to restore what was there before, right? Totally makes sense. If we had looked for it, we would never have found it because no such of a thing ever existed. Roderick Creek is not a creek. Once it comes down out of the Coast Range, it's this beautiful stream, waterfalls, narrow little slot canyons, beautiful cedar trees growing along the banks of the stream, drops into the bottom of the valley there and hits the ditch and goes straight to Gales Creek. That's what it did when we bought our farm. That is not what it ever did historically. It never went straight to Gales Creek. It became part of this. I'm going to go back to that slide. Oh my gosh, it's way back there. Right here. It became part of this. Just this continuous complex of marsh and swamp habitats. It's incredible. Oh, I forgot to brag. We have the longest beaver dam in the Willamette Valley. So that's my. That wasn't me. I didn't build it. It's almost 1,000 feet long. And so what beaver do in this situation is it's almost like rice paddies. They're just trying to expand and hold and stop water wherever they can. And they chase it. And so I can't quite explain it. But at the toe of the slope of the Coast Range, you have all these little tiny feeder streams. All of them are pointed towards the major drainage ways. But the beaver never let them get there. They just stopped them right there. And then the water, of course, does work its way through that series of dams, and then they stop it again, and then they stop it again, and they stop it again, and you end up, they just spread the water across the landscape. And you can see this at the toe of the slope, and it's really, really cool. One of the things that, so there were a couple of things, and I have a slide, and I don't have time to dig it up. But the first thing that came at me when I said, gosh, this is really neat, as I'm looking at 15 acres of water in downtown Beaverton, the first thing that came back was, there's no shade on that water. Oh, no. It's so funny. You know, and I thought, yeah, there's no shade on that water. It's probably pretty warm in August when it's 98 degrees. That water's probably heating right up. You know, across a large expanse of water, there's going to be areas where the water's cooler, warmer. And it's not like there's no shade, right? There's shade around the margins, right? And there's also groundwater. The effect of these beaver on groundwater is unbelievable. But the second thing that I said, well, what about the groundwater? The people said, well, gosh, you know, all this clay, there's no way water's really moving through that clay very fast. It's not like Utah or Colorado where the water just goes into the gravel and spreads around. Yeah, so it can't, you know, no. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, has ever really wrapped their head around exactly how this works in the Willamette Valley. But what I do know is that my map of these wetland soils is by no means the limit of the extent of the influence of beaver on the landscape. These guys go nuts when it rains. So they've filled up all this green stuff. It's all covered with water. And then they start pushing it outside of the wetland footprint. There's beaver water. The beaver would push water across another 10 acres of my farm if I let them without blinking. And all of a sudden, they're out of the wetland clay. And they're into chehalis and other well-drained soils. And the water just goes right in. But when it rains, they go nuts. They'll start pushing dams. They use the force of the water to build more dams and to revet and to augment the dams that are already there. Because all that water is moving across the landscape, even when they've spread it out really widely. There's enough flow that there's flow everywhere, and it's pushing towards their dams because it's trying to get downstream, right? Well, they go crazy. They start rooting around and digging up grass and twigs and stuff. And then they raft that material towards their stream, towards their dams, and they make them bigger. And they'll extend them widthwise too. So, right, they've spanned the channel, or a swale or whatever it is that they're trying to block, and then the water goes around. Well, they just build the dam farther that way, in both directions. It's absolutely remarkable. And so they're pushing water off the wetland clay and into these better drained upland soils where the water just goes straight down into the groundwater. These things are like pumps. Every time it rains, they're whoof, whoof, whoof. They're just pushing water into the ground. And it's December and January, and it's freaking cold. And that water all that cold water is going down into the ground. And then it comes out in other parts of my farm. But mostly it ends up coming out of the bank at Gales Creek, which is, one of our few steelhead streams in the basin. And those fish really appreciate that cold water that's coming out in May, June, July, and August. Anyway, it's a huge, huge story.
How long before they come back after they move on? How long will growth visit?
Again, a really good question. I would expect something comparable to, and maybe even, I should just say, maybe comparable to our planted stuff, right? So we have all this natural regeneration. It's incredibly, incredibly dense. That might have some influence because it's going to constrain the diameter growth of the material that comes back. Eventually they'll self-thin and they'll get wherever they'll grow. It'll be great. I guess 3 or 4 years, they'll come back. They never really completely go away either. I mean, not really, not out of any big kind of stream wetland complex.
So I'm curious with the beaver dam analogs type restoration projects, are you seeing any that are making big mistakes? And if so, like what would be a biggest mistake that folks are making that we should watch out for?
Not to be flippant again, but by doing it at all, I think, again, we all want to do this, and I've done it myself. I've built beaver dam analogs, so I'm kind of stupid too. But you watch how it works, right? They either use them or they don't. That's all you got to do. It's all you got to do. You just grow the willows. It's the only thing that's really sustainable, right? It's the simplest. Just get out of their way. Plant the stuff and step back.
From a practical sense, I know you skipped past selectability or plant selection, but I think there are several folks in the room that are interested in the specifics of
Yeah.
plants, whether you're willing to do a Cliff's note of that or point to George's favorite website of that.
Thanks for bringing us back. So the question is about selectivity, beaver selectivity, and it's important, right? You need to know what you're doing. If you want beaver, I don't recommend that you only plant willows. If you want beaver, I recommend that you plant it all. And they'll pick out what they want, eat what they want, use stuff for dams, and then there'll be some nice spirea there for the bees later. And other stuff too, it's remarkable. All our flora, our woody flora is really quite remarkable. We have a really impressive shrubby and hardwood tree flora, mostly shrubs. It's a rich flora for shrubs, considering how far north we are. So use it all. It's twinberry. Twinberry is a great one.
If I wanted to know more about the different types of willow and where they're sort of best, where would I?
There's some great taxonomists down at Oregon State who have spent a lot of time working on willows. Do anybody know Barb Wilson, Dick Brainerd? Who am I forgetting? Another guy down there, super great guy. He's actually based out of Portland. There's some really good people. But for nuts and bolts of Willamette Valley floor stuff, I've got a vegetative key to the Willamette Valley willows that's pretty rock solid. I'd be glad to share that with people. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I'm just wondering how many beaver you think you have on your farm.
Ooh. Where's the beaver biologist? We got a beaver. We got a
Beaver per acre.
yeah. BPAs. Yeah. Are there any beaver biologists here today? Oh gosh, too bad. There's so many people that are more expert on the animal side of this than I am. I'm a plant guy. I love these little guys. Apparently, they're really tasty, by the way. And I'm not averse to giving it a try. But apparently, they make a great pot roast. And there's a lot of them. There are a lot of them. They're I have at one time in our upper pond above the longest beaver dam in the Willamette Valley, I've seen 4 beaver there, 1 adult and 3 kits, actually, at dusk, which was remarkable. And I hear them periodically. They're very furtive, as you're probably aware. So they don't really show themselves. We also have a lot of muskrats, which is awesome. Muskrats love beaver ponds, as it turns out. And I love muskrats. They're really cute little things. But I don't know. Actually, it's a great question. We had a whole army of biologists from ODF and W, and ODF actually has gotten interested in this. There's starting to be a real turnaround, particularly at the state level. But ODFW is definitely moving forward, and I think they're going to be a strong ally for making good choices here.
Great presentation. I appreciate the information included about the agency responses.
Oh.
It was interesting, but I have a question about beaver exclusion, and if you can use some of those vegetation taxes that they don't like if you've gotten a super urban setting and there's a highway that you really don't want them to go towards because you don't want to put up a fence either.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of plans you use to block them?
That is a great question. I don't have any definitive experimental evidence to support it, just anecdotal stuff. But if you look at a stand of spirea, I'm sure most of you have experienced this, they're just sticks like crazy. And these beaver are pretty big critters, the adults anyway. Now the kits they're not super agile on ground. So I think, what I've tried to do in some cases, rather than put wire cages around my cottonwoods if I wanted to keep a cottonwood or an ash tree or something, I'd never do that. I mean, just let them have it, whatever. But if you bury them in the spirea, they tend not to get cut. So I think there's more work to be done there. And I should say there's so much more that we can learn about these creatures by constructing, just building, coming up with well thought through experiments and trials. And that would be a great one. That'd be a great one. Yeah. Other?
I was just wondering, just thinking out loud, like the evolutionary relationship between beaver and salmon, like getting over those dams and like with the Missoula floods and what's a snapshot in time?
I don't think the beaver dams withstood the Missoula floods.
No, I'm just thinking. Absolutely. Did they get all wiped out or did they push them down?
No, that's a great question. I mean, how did anything survive the Missoula floods? It's a great question. 10,000. The salmon did find. Salmon are remarkably robust to incredible amounts of disturbance. And again, this is a fish biologist question, but one of the things in my conversations with people who are focused particularly on coho is that coho and beaver, if you wanted to find the biggest juvenile cohos, find out where the beaver are and go look there. I don't know how they do it, but they get over, under, and around these things, and I think a lot of it is timing, and a lot of fish movement happens. Just as the beaver become very active at high water, so do the fish, and that's when they're really trying to find ways over, under, and around. Maybe our fish biologists would like to weigh in on how they get over dams. No, you're more than welcome. Okay, well, I try to listen. There are experts at these things, and it's always great. The world's full of experts. A lot of us are expert at something or another. My thing is plants. I try to pay attention to other things. I desperately try to learn birds, but I really struggle. Gosh, we got so much to learn from each other. And I've learned some of the greatest things from farmers that I've worked with, from other foresters that I've worked with, wildlife biologists. If we all kind of figure out what our lane is and try to stay in and do the best we can to bring the people in that have the expertise that we need, that's when we make progress, I think. Darren?
Plants question for you.
Oh, good.
So the research I've read around forested riparian zones is that there tends to be a lot of patches whenever you have natural regeneration due to disturbance. So you have patches of species. But I'm not familiar with the Willamette Valley and floodplains. And so in places where you have natural kind of disturbance-based riparian species that get established, are they established in patches? And what I'm leading to, my question is, that compared to planting plans, it seems like I see a lot of planting plans where they're trying to introduce diversity, and it's all mixed, like one tree is different than the next one, the next to it, that's different from the shrub, that's different, as opposed to patches. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on natural disturbance, how they establish, and then how that compares to your planting.
That's a great observation, and again, it points out some of the things that we have to learn. And we've spent a lot of time, and there's just piles of journal articles about the silviculture of Douglas fir. We don't know doodly about hardwoods. Nothing. Practically zero. A little bit of work on alder, not enough. A little bit, but nothing. I mean, who's studying dogwoods? Nobody. Nobody's looking at this. Spirea? Nah. There's so much to learn about how do we deploy this stuff in the landscape. And ultimately, I think more importantly is, how does all this stuff play out in the long run? You know, the idea that I'm going to be walking around in some patch of ground spraying stuff for, eternity, no way. From a plant population standpoint, even if we wanted to, even if we threw all of our resources at forcing things to happen, that they're not possible. These life forces that we have unleashed of that 25,000 species of plants, not counting the fungi and the bacteria and the viruses and the insects and everything else we've introduced, nutria, that we've introduced in the Willamette Valley. All this stuff is still alive and it's out there and it's doing its thing. So an enormous opportunity, an enormous and important field of study that's practically still unbelievably ignored is, what does this mean? We still have people looking at these pristine natural systems and saying, oh my gosh, look how incredible these things are. The problem is those things they're done. They're a view of the past. They're not what's coming. We have no idea what's coming at us. So no, we are not planting stuff right. We are doing, as you said, dogwood, alder, cottonwood, swamp rose, blah, 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 blah. We waste an enormous number of plants because we put stuff in the wrong place without thinking about what it's going to look like in 5 years, what it's going to look like in 10 years. We get a cottonwood and an Oregon grape, two species which probably rarely ever coexisted in the first place. And this poor little guy down here is like, I've seen a lot of dead plants underneath cottonwoods that are 80 feet tall already. So it's an important point.